Paleo Runner Podcast is devoted to finding better ways to live, run, train, and eat. I'm your host, Aaron Olson. You can find more information by going to paleorunner.org. If you enjoy the show, please go to iTunes and leave a review. Search for Paleo Runner in iTunes and click Ratings and Reviews. You can also follow me on Facebook.com/RunPaleo or on Twitter @RunPaleo. I wanted to take a minute to let you know about a product I've been using called 3Fuel. 3Fuel is a sports drink that gives you fat, protein, and carbohydrates to use as a fuel source. Unlike sugary sports drinks, 3Fuel gets absorbed slowly into your bloodstream to give you sustained energy throughout your workout. If you'd like to give it a try, you can get 10% off by using the coupon code 3FOLSON. Go to paleorunner.org and click 3Fuel at the top of the page. If you're listening through the podcast app on iPhone, click the link displayed on the app right now. My guest today is Dr. Mary Newport. She has practiced neonatology in Florida since 1983 and has served as a founding medical director for 2 newborn intensive care units and is currently in full-time practice as a neonatologist in Tampa Bay area. In September of 2011, she published her book, Alzheimer's Disease, What If There Was a Cure? Dr. Mary Newport, it's great to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me to come on.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you today. Can you give our listeners a little bit of a background about how you got interested in Alzheimer's disease and then publishing a book called What If There Was a Cure?
Yeah, well, as you said, I'm a neonatologist, so I take care of sick and premature newborns. So Alzheimer's is kind of at the opposite end of the age spectrum. But the reason I'm so interested is that my husband, Steve, has early onset Alzheimer's disease. Mm-hmm. And he's 63 now. He was about 51 years old when he started having problems, so the early form of the disease. And basically he stayed home to take care of our children, but he was an accountant and worked full-time as an accountant from our home, from my practice, for a lot of years and actually functioned very well in that position. And then when he was 51, he started having problems with his accounting work. That was the most noticeable thing at first, that he would make some really big boo-boos on the payroll, writing checks for people, sometimes several thousand more than they were supposed to get, that kind of thing. And then procrastinating on doing tax returns was kind of the next thing we started seeing. And he just had a lot of trouble getting himself organized to do that kind of thing. And but then he started having problems remembering if he'd been to the bank and the post office. And that seemed really abnormal for me. I didn't think I would ever forget that on a given day if I'd done that. And he started misplacing mail, and I didn't know if he'd been there or not because he couldn't remember, and something just wasn't right. And he was also depressed at that point, and the doctor that we took him to felt that we talked about dementia, but he thought it was more likely that his memory issues were related to depression. And now I think it is that the depression was probably more related to the memory issues, that he, realized he was having trouble. I mean, he told me that many times, that he knew something was wrong, seriously wrong, and he became very depressed over his inability to function the way he had. So, but he was put on an antidepressant. It didn't really help, the memory issues at all. And when he was in 2003, so he was 53 at that point, we moved to Spring Hill, Florida, for me to open a new newborn intensive care unit. It was about an hour north of where we had lived, so really not too far from where we had lived for many years. But he had great difficulty learning his way around, and it's a relatively small town, just a few north, south, east, west arteries. And he was always confused about what road he was on, which direction he was heading, and that was just very atypical for him. He'd always been able to find his way around before, and he could no longer seem to read a map, and that was concerning. And then he started spending a huge amount of time in our garage looking for things, and he'd have in his mind that he wanted to find something like the hitch for his truck in the morning. And I'd leave for work, at the hospital, and I'd come back at dinner time, and he'd still be out there looking for it. Oh. And that was just very odd. And then he couldn't even remember what he was looking for at that point, but he was still looking for it. It was just odd behavior. And so I talked to our local Alzheimer family organization to get a doctor recommendation, somebody who deals with Alzheimer's, a neurologist. And so we saw him, and he did a whole battery of tests. And, one of them was a simple memory test called the mini mental status exam. It's a 30-point test. And, most people will get 30 points, and occasionally you might miss a point, but that's still considered normal. But he only got 23 out of 30 points, and that was kind of a shock. And one of them is drawing a picture like intersecting trapezoids. And it was very bizarre looking, it didn't look anything like a trapezoid. And it was just very kind of interesting to see, something like that. But for us, it was shocking, that he did have, something obvious going on. And basically things like B12 deficiency and hypothyroidism that can cause memory impairment, those types of things were ruled out. And he actually had a normal MRI at that point, which is pretty typical for somebody in the early stages of Alzheimer's. And but the doctor felt that he did have some type of dementia and started following him periodically, and every 6 months or so he would come back, and then he did see worsening, and he started developing some physical symptoms too, like a tremor. And so he felt that he most likely had Alzheimer's type dementia. And we went for a second opinion at the Bird Alzheimer's Center in Tampa, and they did a whole battery of cognitive testing, and they agreed that he had most likely early onset Alzheimer's. And so he was put on medications at that point, the typical ones that help, are used for Alzheimer's, and they didn't really do much, but we kept him going anyway for actually quite a few years.
Mm-hmm. So you started to look into the idea of possibly adding coconut oil to his diet and seeing if that might help. How did you get interested in coconut oil and that?
Yeah, that was really an accident, and I recognized it because of my job, the type of work I do as a neonatologist. We were looking for clinical trials for Steve, and up to that point, he wouldn't qualify for anything, which was very frustrating because he had the history of depression. Retrospectively, it's very bizarre, because if you had early onset Alzheimer's, wouldn't you be depressed, So
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So we couldn't get him into any clinical trials, but then they kind of stopped using that as an exclusion criteria. And there were two new drugs that were about to start clinical trials in Tampa and in St. Pete, Florida, and they both were aimed at reducing plaque in the brain. People who study Alzheimer's or have a loved one with Alzheimer's are usually aware that there's a problem with plaques and tangles in the brain, that those are the hallmarks of the disease. At autopsy, that's what they look for to confirm Alzheimer's. And these two drugs were aimed at reducing plaque in the brain. One was a vaccine and one was an oral medication. And belief was that if you could remove plaque from the brain, that the person could potentially improve, because these are like toxic to the neurons, these plaques. So he was scheduled for screenings for these two drugs on 2 back-to-back days, and he had screened for one of them 2 weeks earlier, and he got only 12 out of 30 on the MMSE at that point, so he had deteriorated quite a lot, from when he was first diagnosed. He was no longer able to do any accounting, simple math, even turn on a computer. He could no longer do any of that, and this is in 2008 that we're looking for these clinical trials. So he was scheduled again to try again, and then this other clinical trial became available. So you can only be in one clinical trial. So the night before the first screening, I was on the internet looking for the risks and the benefits of the two drugs to try to help us decide, say he gets accepted into both studies, which one do we pick? And then I just happened upon a press release for a third treatment, and it was a medical food. At that time it was called AC1202 or Ketones, and it's now called Axona, Axona. And it was not going to be coming out at least for another year at the point that I was reading about it. But what it said was that it improved the memories of nearly half of the people with Alzheimer's who took it. And I thought that was intriguing because you don't hear that about any of the Alzheimer's drugs, that it improves memory. So, but it didn't say what it was or how it worked. So I explored further, and I found a patent application on a website called Free Patents Online, where you can look up basically any U.S. patent. And it had the application on there. It was 75 pages long. And it started off by discussing an aspect of Alzheimer's that I really was not very familiar with, that I hadn't heard much about, that it's a type of diabetes of the brain, or called type 3 diabetes. And what I learned from that, there are a number of different groups that have been studying it, but a group at Brown University headed by Dr. Suzanne Delamonte and Mark Wands, they have studied the brains of people who died with Alzheimer's, basically. And what they had done in 2005 was to they reported basically that they had studied brains of people that did not have type 1 or type 2 diabetes that had died with Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. And what they found was that there is insulin deficiency and insulin resistance in the Alzheimer's brain. In every brain they looked at, this was a problem. So they coined the term type 3 diabetes to indicate Alzheimer's disease. And then they did, and this was in 2005, and then in 2008 they did further studies where they had looked at Alzheimer's brains at all different stages, from the earliest stage to the most severe stages. And again, these people did not have type 1 or type 2 diabetes. And what they found was that the insulin deficiency and insulin resistance is present in the areas of the brain where Alzheimer's starts, and that over time, with each stage of the disease, that it worsens and that it progresses throughout the brain until it's very severe. And basically, it's probably most similar to type 2 diabetes, although insulin deficiency is part of type 1 diabetes.
So are you saying there that when you say type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain, that means that the brain's not able to use glucose efficiently? Is that correct?
Right. And it's not the entire brain that's affected by it, but it starts in an area called the hippocampus and amygdala, which are associated with memory. That's where this problem seems to start, but it does progress throughout the brain. But good parts of the brain, certain parts of the brain can still use glucose normally. Okay. So, but what happens is, with the insulin resistance, there's also a problem with the insulin receptors on these cells. There's a group at, it's I think Case Western in Cleveland that have found that the insulin receptors, instead of being on the cell membrane, that they're buried in the cell. So they're somehow being prevented from coming to the surface of the cell membrane. And I've read that there's other receptors like this that are affected that way in Alzheimer's. But effectively, when glucose is the primary fuel for brain cells and most of our other cells most of the time in our usual diet, which is a relatively high carbohydrate in the USA. And you need insulin to get glucose into the cells, and those insulin receptors need to be there too. And as you start losing, this ability to get glucose into the cell, if you don't have some other alternative source of fuel, the cell's going to malfunction and it's going to die off eventually. And the thing about humans is that we have something like 100 billion neurons. So this process is believed that it's going on for at least 10 or 20 years before you start seeing symptoms, before enough cells start dying off that you start seeing obvious symptoms. They've done PET scans in people who have strong family history of Alzheimer's that are at risk. And even in their 20s, some people already have decreased glucose uptake in the parts of their brain. Really? Yeah, but they're normal. I mean, they don't seem to have symptoms at that point, so it's really decades later, that they start having symptoms because really of the sheer number of neurons that we have, and there's something like 100 trillion synapses, which are the connections between neurons. So so how does the coconut oil play in effect? Does that basically that's your alternate fuel source? It provides alternative fuel, and so this when you are starving. Go on a fast, or, like there are many people in the world that are starving, like in the Philippines right now. There are people that aren't getting food. You tap into your fat, and this is just, it's an evolutionary thing. It's probably one reason humans have been able to exist as a species is because we can switch over, including our brains, very easily from using glucose to using ketones. And ketones are a product of fat breakdown. You break down fat. Some of your muscles, your heart muscle can use fatty acids instead of glucose very easily in this situation. But the long-chain fatty acids don't cross very easily into the brain. They don't cross the blood-brain barrier very well. And but your liver converts some of the fatty acids to ketones, and ketones do cross very well. when you have elevated ketones, it actually increases blood flow to the brain, and then the brain can take up these ketones and just, they're used up very quickly, once they cross the blood-brain barrier, taken up by the neurons. And they don't need insulin to get into the cells. And it's much less complex process, actually, to get ketones in than to get glucose into cells. Fewer enzymes are needed and different transporters. But there's a group in Canada, Stephen Cunnane, it's Cunnane. He has a ketone PET scanner, and he does ketone and glucose PET scans back to back.
Oh, okay.
And he they just released a report last week at a conference out in San Diego that the Alzheimer brain can, some of the feeling out there was that there's decreased glucose uptake in those parts of the brain because those neurons are dead. But what he found when he did the ketone PET scan, that it's normal, that those cells and those parts of the brains that are not using glucose are taking up ketones normally, like a normal healthy brain.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So those cells so this really supports the idea of using an alternative fuel, for somebody with Alzheimer's.
So when you gave your husband, this is a pretty personal story for you, and when you gave your husband that coconut oil to use those medium chain fats that are in coconut oil as an alternate fuel, did you see improvements right away, or did it take a while? Okay.
It was, some was right away, and then there were other improvements that happened over time, but so as I'm reading this patent application, then what this medical food was one of the medium-chain triglycerides. And basically, the triglycerides are short, medium, long, and very long chain, and they're categorized that way based on how many carbons atoms are in the chain and the fatty acid chain. And so the medium chains are at the lower end. They don't need digestive enzymes to be absorbed. And the reason I recognize medium chain triglyceride, or MCT oil, is that we used it for our premature newborns back in the late 70s, early 80s.
Okay.
The very tiniest ones, we would add it to their feedings because it was absorbed very well, tolerated very well, and it helped them gain weight a lot faster. And it really, as used, medium chain triglycerides are not stored as fat. They're used by bodybuilders to increase lean body mass, for example. They're burned right away as energy, but part of the medium-chain triglyceride is converted in the liver to ketones. So we've got, actually, as it turns out, two sources of alternative fuel. One are the ketones produced by the liver that cross into the brain, but we also know that the medium-chain triglycerides cross into the blood-brain barrier, and there's some work from 1991, actually, that the astrocytes, which are brain cells that help nourish the neurons, that they convert medium-chain triglyceride also to ketones, and also to acetyl-CoA, which is it's one of the molecules that feeds into the chain reaction that results in production of ATP, which is the final energy molecule that allows the cells to carry out their functions. So both ketones and medium-chain triglycerides can function as alternative fuel in the brain. Yeah, so what I did not know, and I found out from the patent application, was that MCT oil is extracted from coconut oil. And I knew I had seen coconut oil on the shelf. I didn't know MCT oil was available as a supplement, but it is. And so basically what happened, I was on the internet till about 1 a.m., and he had a screening at 9 a.m., and I didn't have a chance to go out and buy coconut oil, but he went for the screening, and they did the MMSE test, the mini mental status exam test, the 30-point test, and he scored only 14, and they needed 16 to get into the trial. So on the way home, actually before we left, the doctor said, let's have him draw a clock. This is a clock test for Alzheimer's. It's a very specific test. And he drew a few little random circles and a few numbers. It wasn't organized in a big circle like a clock at all. It was very disorganized. And she told me he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's, and that was pretty devastating for us. And I thought, what do we have to lose,
Right.
So I went far out of my way where I knew I had seen coconut oil, and picked some up, and got home, and I got on the internet and I started researching coconut oil, and I learned that it was 60% medium chain triglycerides. that MCT oil was extracted from it. And basically, I calculated how much coconut oil would be equal to the dosage that they were using for the medical food. So they were using 20 grams of MCT oil, which is about 4 teaspoons, and that equated to about 7 teaspoons or a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. And so the next day I gave him a little over 2 tablespoons. I had put it in oatmeal at the time. It's solid at room temperature, and it melts very easily when you put it into warm food. So at that point I put it into oatmeal, and he ate it, and his screening was set for 1 p.m. And on the way down I was trying to prepare him for it, reminding him what the day of the week was and the season and all that, and he couldn't even come up with the word spring and much less remember anything, and I was very discouraged. I thought it's not going to be any better. But then when we got down there, it's like it kicked in. They took him for the test, and he gained 4 points from the day before, and he qualified for the study. He remembered suddenly that it was spring. He remembered the day of the week. He remembered what floor he was on, where he was at. I mean, it was surprising. It was things he couldn't remember the day before that he did. And at that point, I didn't know for sure, was it the coconut oil or was it just really good luck or, what had happened. But I thought, there's no harm in continuing it. So
it's just a food.
Yeah, so I started giving it to him every morning, and then started cooking with it the rest of the day, too. I thought, a little bit will help in the morning, maybe giving it to him throughout the day will help also. And so at first I was mostly just cooking with it, learning everything I could about it, and then eventually ended up giving him 3 and then 4 measured doses a day, throughout the day with meals. And what we did see, though, fairly early on was that he had much more energy. Like in the mornings before that, he would be very sluggish, barely talking, a lot of tremor in his hand and in his jaw. When he would try to talk, his jaw would tremor. And he had a lot of trouble completing sentences, even simple. He would lose his train of thought, midway through very frequently, and couldn't find a spoon, couldn't get water out of the door of the refrigerator, and things like that. And that just turned around fairly quickly, where he came out very alert and talkative. His sense of humor came back. There was more animation in his face. He could get the utensils. The tremor, virtually disappeared, except when he would be late getting coconut oil, and we'd see the tremor come back. And
that's just an incredible story. How you gave him that, and then pretty quickly his whole mood turned around. How much did you actually have to give him in those 3 to 4 doses?
Well, just in the beginning it was a little over 2 tablespoons. That produced some results. But then we worked up to. I mean, I just felt that. Well, we measured ketone levels. There was a Dr. Richard Veach at the NIH who is a world expert on ketones, and I contacted him and to just kind of get his opinion. I didn't tell him at first what I was doing with Steve, but I wanted to see if he thought it was possible that coconut oil, the ketones from that would be enough to produce improvement. And I knew the answer, but I didn't tell him right away that I was actually giving Steve coconut oil. He didn't really think the levels would be high enough, and he had been in contact with the people who were making Axona, and he just really didn't think that it would be enough to produce benefit. So about 2 weeks after we started the coconut oil, Steve drew another clock, and this time it was a complete circle. It had all the numbers 1 through 12 in the right order going around the clock, and it had a lot of these weird little spokes going through it, which I think kind of represented the hands of the clock or something. But it was a vast improvement from the previous clock, and I faxed those to Dr. Veach, and he was really taken aback. He was really shocked and became very interested at that point. So then he about a month or so, about 6 weeks later, he said, let's do levels on Steve, give him the measured dose of coconut oil, and we did it twice that day, breakfast and dinner. At that point, I was doing 2 doses measured, and he measured his ketone levels, and we did see a bump up, his ketone levels. After breakfast, it peaked at around 3 hours, and there was still a little bit left at dinner time, and then after dinner, his level went up quite a bit, and then we stopped measuring at 3 hours, but it was still headed up at that point. So he was kind of surprised by that, and that's when I decided to add the lunch dose, because you could see it dropping down, almost, very low by dinner time. And I thought if we give it to him at lunch, that should keep the ketones up, most of the day. And then I eventually added a 4th dose at bedtime, to help him, thinking it would help him get through the night, that it has ketones available 24/7. So we worked up to the point where he was getting 9 to 11 tablespoons a day, basically, and then also cooking, throwing coconut oil and coconut everything, coconut milk, grated coconut, into everything. And Dr. Veach had also had us give him just MCT oil and just one dose, and he measured his ketone levels after that, and it peaked at 90 minutes, but the ketones were gone after 3 hours. So it was pretty clear that one dose a day wasn't going to be enough, and that's what Axona is. It's they're studying now adding additional doses and looking at different amounts,
Did you notice a correlation with his moods and his memory?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
His
as far as the level of ketones?
What was that?
As far as the level of ketones? Did you...
Eventually, the level with coconut and MCT oil is not real high. It's not. It's a bump up. I don't know if you're familiar with the levels.
Yeah, I've actually tried that for myself, just for athletic performance, and I tried doing the low carb diet, and along with a little bit of coconut oil and things like that. But you can measure these things with just a $10 device that you can buy on Amazon. I'll put a link up to it.
Yeah,
and,
I didn't know that at the time either. Yeah, there's two Novamax Plus and Precision Extra, they're called, and they're glucose meters that diabetics use. And you can get ketone strips too. You can check blood sugar with them, and you can check ketones. And we've done this quite a bit with Steve now, but probably the highest levels that we've gotten with just straight coconut oil and low carb diet is around 0.9 or 1, but not extremely low carb. I've been encouraged off and on to put them on the classic ketogenic diet, which is extremely high fat, very minimal carbohydrate, and just enough protein to maintain lean body mass. And but the thing is, Dr. Kunane, in Canada, he's like, the rest of the brain can use glucose perfectly well. So if, say, you have a little bit of ketone available, if you don't provide enough glucose, the brain that can use glucose is going to also use ketones, and it might be more effective to allow some carbohydrate in the diet, You see what I'm saying? And then the area that needs the ketones will be able to take, will have it available, basically. So I've been a little reluctant to go, extreme low carb, but his carbohydrate intake is probably somewhere around 50 to 75 grams a day, which is still on the low side compared to what most people eat.
And is this something that you've done along with him as well?
Yeah, I've cut way back. I rarely eat bread, rice, pasta. This weekend was an exception. Our daughter got married, wedding cake and that kind of thing. But, for the most part, I've cut way, way back on the amount of carbohydrate, that I'm eating, and way more vegetables than I used to. I mean, Steve and I, basically were on a convenience food diet until somewhere around 2006, and I became much more aware that nutrition could be playing a role in his disease. And also, I was kind of headed towards type 2 diabetes. I didn't have it, but my blood sugars were borderline, and my weight was very, very up there. I still have a weight issue, but I've managed to keep off about 45 pounds since 2006.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah, it's great. So, but, I didn't eat much vegetables up to that point, and now I eat a lot of vegetable, a whole lot of vegetable. I don't eat much fruit, and Steve doesn't either, like strawberries. We'll give him some strawberries and that kind of thing. But, for the most part, we've gotten away from anything made with white flour, for one thing, and, basically bread in general, Steve doesn't eat it at all. Very rarely I'll have a piece of bread, I just, we've kind of gotten away from a lot of that excess carbohydrate. Yeah.
Some people listening to this might be thinking, well, this seems like a pretty strange thing to do with all this coconut oil and everything, but you as a neonatologist actually know that newborns actually use ketones. I think it's while they're still in the womb even. So can you tell the audience that's listening a little bit about that?
Yeah. It's so interesting. And I didn't really know this so much until I started studying ketones and medium-chain triglycerides more. The fetus, as they've looked back as far as 20 weeks, and even at 20 weeks, the fetus is able to use ketones efficiently in the brain and other organs. And a mother who is pregnant, a woman who is pregnant, goes into ketosis more readily too. It probably is an evolutionary thing too, to protect the mother and the baby during a pregnancy. But when a baby is born, a baby that is exclusively breastfed will go into ketosis during the first 12 hours or so of life. And if you think about it, human babies are very chubby compared to most other mammal, newborns. And so they have this fat to tap into that they can break down and start making ketones. And then human breast milk has about like 10 to 17% of the lipids in human breast milk are medium chain triglycerides.
Okay.
And so the baby can use the medium chain, and the medium chains part of it will be converted to ketones. And women who breastfeed know this, but often the first like 24 to 48 hours, there's very little milk. There's a little bit of colostrum, and you think, what in the world is the baby getting? But they're using their fat, and the ketones, basically compensate for the lack of volume of breast milk at that point, and it gets the baby through, those first days, until the breast milk comes in, and then the levels of ketones tend to slack off after that in the newborn. Babies that get a combination of formula and breast milk, no ketosis.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
It just shuts it off right away. The extra carbohydrate, I guess it's in the infant formula, tends to turn off. Like when blood sugar is high, your natural ketosis turns right off. Like there are children that are on very strict ketogenic diet, like I was talking about earlier, to control epilepsy. That's been around for about 90 years. And it kind of went out of favor when the drugs started coming along, but there were still children out there that they would try 5 different drugs and they still had severe seizures, frequent seizures. And Johns Hopkins all along had continued a program where they would admit children to the hospital, fast them for several days, and then put them on a ketogenic diet. And it's a very strict, you have to measure every single morsel of food that goes into the mouth. It's very strictly calculated as far as the fat to carbohydrate and protein ratios. And but these children, they call it the birthday cake syndrome. If they have one piece of birthday cake, like on their birthday, they will have a seizure. They immediately go out of ketosis. Okay. And it can take several days to get back into it again. So,
so do you think go ahead.
So you think, like somebody with Alzheimer's, it's going to be very, very hard to keep them on a classic ketogenic diet to keep their ketones elevated. So, the coconut oil and MCT oil are that's a way of elevating ketones and providing some of this alternative fuel, without having to do an extreme low carbohydrate diet, basically.
Yeah, it's a great option for people because they don't have to be quite as rigid with their diet. Now, one thing I've noticed about the MCT oil is it can cause some upset stomach. Yeah,
coconut oil does that to some people too, and so, what I found, because I've heard from so many people about this now, is that it's a good idea to start with a small amount. Like Steve tolerated 2 tablespoons right away, but not everybody does, and some people just 1 teaspoon will give them diarrhea, even coconut oil or MCT oil. Okay. So I suggest that people start with like a half a teaspoon to 1 teaspoon 2 or 3 times a day, and to take it with food, and that's MCT oil or coconut oil, and then just increase by that amount every couple days if they're handling it okay, and until they get up to the point where they're somewhere between shooting for at least 4 to 6 tablespoons a day. Some people never do handle quite that much, and some people do fine on less. I mean, they actually have improvements with less. But some of the people that I've talked to now that have had some long-term success, several years that they've been stable, are taking large amounts, like somewhere around 9 or 10 tablespoons a day. Okay.
And have you tried coconut butter?
Yeah, coconut butter is good too. It's more like whole coconut pureed, but it still has a lot of the oil in it. It's probably about 80% of the oil compared to within a tablespoon of just straight coconut oil. So it's very high in coconut oil. And coconut milk has most of the calories are oil in coconut milk. Okay. The ones you buy in the carton, though, like they carry them in the milk section, and they have half gallons of a couple of different brands. They are extremely diluted with water. Okay. So they're like 50 to 90 calories in 8 ounces. And I get canned undiluted coconut milk, and I dilute it like 1 can of coconut water I add to it, because coconut water has a lot of nutrients in it, and it's very tasty when you add it back to the coconut milk. But you can use tap water too if you don't have coconut water. Coconut water is pretty pricey at this point, but that is more like 150 calories in 8 ounces. So it's 2 to 3 times as many calories as what the manufacturers are putting out there. Tastes better too. Okay. But you'll get a lot more coconut oil, if you kind of do it that way.
Is there any danger of getting getting too many ketones through just eating it through your diet?
Not really. People and a lot of doctors, right away they think diabetic ketoacidosis, and that's a situation in which a person with type 1, type 1 diabetes has basically no insulin on board, the blood sugar is extremely high, and their body starts putting out ketones like crazy, and they can become very acidic, very acidotic, from that. But the levels that you get with diabetic ketoacidosis are like 10 to 25 times higher than you can possibly get eating a large amount of coconut oil or MCT oil.
Okay.
So your body's very easily able to buffer the small amount of ketone, relatively speaking, that you're getting from eating these oils.
So do you think that this could work as a prophylactic for people who want to avoid getting dementia or Alzheimer's in the future?
Yes, I do. And the reason I say that is Dr. Cunane that I mentioned earlier with this ketone scanner and all of that, he's found that consuming MCT oil can provide something like 5 to 10% of the energy requirement of the brain. And what he has found, and others have found, was that the energy deficit in the brain of somebody who is at risk for Alzheimer's is somewhere around 5 to 10%. He believes that, MCT oil can provide that energy deficit. So it could potentially delay or even prevent, the onset. And so I have it on both sides of my family, grandparents on both sides, and a maternal aunt that died with Alzheimer's. And when Steve started improving, I thought, I'm just going to do this myself, So I usually get at least 4 or 5 tablespoons a day, of coconut. We actually mix coconut and MCT oil now, kind of 1-to-1.
Okay.
And so I take that, and we cook with coconut oil, too. And so I'm doing it for prevention. And, I did notice, and other people have told me the same thing, that I just feel like I have more energy, that my brain is sharper, I can read a lot more and absorb a lot more and retain a lot more information, since I started doing this. And, fairly early on, I noticed that, fairly quickly. And so I do think that it's, worthwhile. And, another interesting thing that it happens to me, but other people have told me, they've written to me and said, is it possible that the MCT oil is, helping me sleep better? And, like people that hadn't remembered their dreams for a while or didn't think they were dreaming are suddenly having a lot of dreams and remembering their dreams.
Really? Interesting.
It's very interesting. And that's if you take it before going to sleep. And, so I have found that for myself, too. It's very intriguing.
How about athletic performance? Have you heard anything about that? Because we have a lot of listeners that are into sports.
Oh, yeah, definitely. MCT oil and coconut oil, by virtue of having MCT oil, do improve athletic performance. And they did a study at the Burt Alzheimer Institute. They're now doing one for coconut oil in people. But they did an animal study, and the main thing that they found in the mice who were getting, it was a ketogenic diet, basically relatively high fat, but it was with coconut and MCT oil that they enriched it. And the animals that were getting that diet compared to the placebo diet had like almost double the endurance of the other, the ones that were on placebo. Yeah.
Can you send me a link to that study? I'd love to see that.
Yeah. And these were mouse models of Alzheimer's. So these animals had, plaques, basically plaques and tangles in the brain. And it did not help that, but it did help their endurance, their physical endurance, which was very interesting.
And that plaque that you mentioned in the brain, isn't there some ideas that could be caused by like an infection or a virus or something like that?
Like a response to it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there is some research out there that they found that it's actually antimicrobial, that they tested, I think, against 8 different bacteria, and it killed all 8 of them.
Oh, really? Okay.
Plaque. So, and then the other thing is herpes simplex virus, type 1, that causes fever blisters. That's been highly associated with Alzheimer's. There's a group in England and now a group in Cincinnati and another group that have been studying it. And what they found was that when they look at the plaques in the brain in people with Alzheimer's and even in normal elderly people, that 90% of these plaques have the DNA of the herpes virus in the plaque.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and there's other organisms, too, that they're finding in the plaque. So it could be a part of the brain's response to infection, these plaques. And there's a certain genetic type that of people that are more prone to getting Alzheimer's, and it has to do with these apolipoproteins. And you get one copy of the gene from each parent, and there's type 2, 3, and 4. And so you can be a combination, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4, depending on what you get from each parent. And people who are type 4 basically are more likely to get Alzheimer's. And if you have 2 copies of that, one from each parent, you're more likely to get it early. But those same people also are much more likely to have herpes simplex virus infections, recurrent fever blisters.
Okay.
Which is very interesting. And, the herpes simplex virus lays dormant in the nerve, and it just erupts periodically. And but those nerves originate deep in the brain, very close to where Alzheimer's starts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it could be that it's in the nerve root in the brain, too. It's erupting in the brain.
Will ketones, I've heard that they could be antibacterial. What about antiviral? Could they have any benefit for that?
Coconut oil is antiviral. The lauric acid is one of the medium-chain triglycerides, and it's half of coconut oil. Half of the fat in coconut oil is lauric acid, LAURIC. And that has been shown to dissolve the lipid capsule of the herpes simplex virus.
Okay, wow.
And it's another one of the things in human breast milk that they say helps a baby fight infection. When they say it helps fight infection, that's one of the components that does that, because it kills yeast, amoeba, protozoa, all different kinds of bacteria and viruses.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why I, continue coconut oil and not just use MCT oil, because MCT oil has almost no lauric acid in it. Mm-hmm. Coconut oil does, and that's the more potent of the antimicrobial medium chains, in coconut oil is the lauric acid. Mm-hmm. And it does cross the blood-brain barrier. And so anyway, so that's one reason why we've kept coconut oil and not just gone to straight MCT oil.
Okay. Well, Dr. Newport, where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
I do have a website. It's coconut, COCONUT, ketones, KETONES.com. There's no Y in it. A lot of people try to put a Y in, they can't find it. Mm-hmm. KETONES.com. And so I have information. I have an article that I wrote in 2008 that you can print out, some diet guidelines you can print out to help get started. There are a lot of the scientific articles related to ketones that can be printed out from there. Videos to watch. It's just free information. People can get there. And I did write a book back in 2011. The first edition came out, and the second edition in 2013. And it's long. It's almost 500 pages, but the first third of the book is our story, what happened with us and, Steve's descent into Alzheimer's and his improvement coming out of it. And then the middle section is all about ketones, the science of ketones. And I've tried to put it into as plain of English as you can for a topic like that. Okay. And some people get bogged down a little bit there. But the third part of the book is about how to incorporate medium-chain triglycerides into the diet, coconut oil and the recipes and that kind of thing in there too. And a lot of questions and answers about it. And then I'm actually working on another short version. It's kind of a practical guide to go along with it to, so that people get the information how to get started up front instead of at the end of the book. Okay. And it's going to be a lot shorter. It's going to summarize the science. I don't know exactly when it should be coming out at the beginning of 2014. And that one's going to, so far, I'm calling it Coconut Oil for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and ALS. And, so people with Parkinson's now, too, I've heard from about 30 people, kind of recently it's getting to them, and some of them are having really amazing results with it, where over time they're having much less tremor, improved balance, speech, less drooling, things like that they have a lot of problem with. And there are a few people that have told me about long-term success. I just didn't know that they were out there until they contacted me recently. And again, they're taking larger amounts of it, somewhere around 8 to 10 tablespoons a day, but you have to work up to that very slowly. And there is a man with Parkinson's. Balance is a big issue in Parkinson's, and he sent me pictures of him walking on a railroad tie. It was very interesting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, I'm getting those kind of reports now, too, and and then there's a man with ALS, Lou Gehrig's, who's been stable for 4 years now, taking 9 tablespoons a day of coconut oil.
Wow, that's just fantastic. And it's just a food.
Yeah, it's just a food, and that's a disease where most people die within 3 to 5 years, and they progress. He actually improved over several months, gradual improvement, and then he has stabilized. And he said like once a year he goes off of coconut oil for about 2 weeks to see if he's all better. But he said he'll have like a little bit of tremor start to come back, and so he starts it up again. But
okay.
Yeah.
Well, when you come out with that new book, send me an email, and I'd love to have you back on the show. I'm sure there'll be a lot of comments and questions on this episode.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Newport, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to another Paleo Runner podcast. If you like podcasts, you're also going to like Audible.com. Audible has over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. If you'd like to get a free audiobook download, go to audibletrial.com/paleorunner or click on the link displayed on the app right now. Thanks for listening.